In 1953, as Russians honored the death of the dictator Joseph Stalin, the world wondered who would step into his enormous shoes. To everyone's surprise, it was the virtually unknown Nikita Khrushchev. Born a peasant, unable to read or write until he was 25, Khrushchev had risen from the ranks through sheer force of personality, as US Vice President Nixon would discover when they met in 1959. Khrushchev was making an unprecedented tour of America and stopped off in Hollywood to meet the cast of the musical Can-Can. The Soviet leader described the dancing as extremely vulgar, but he leapt at the chance to meet the female lead, Shirley MacLaine. Khrushchev hadn't killed off his rivals like Stalin, he'd merely demoted them. And now, after 7 years in power, he was strutting his popular stuff before surprisingly responsive British crowds. The Cold War enemy was showing us an engagingly human face. Lurking in the background, always, was the formidable Mrs. Khrushchev, and a few steps behind her, their two daughters, who joined the Russian leader's entourage. But the tone was about to change. At the UN, Khrushchev shook a defiant fist as Western nations censured the new hardline Soviet policies. And the worst of these was that dreadful symbol of division, the Berlin Wall. It was a fortified barrier that split a great city in two, separating wives from husbands and parents from children. Soon the wall would spread across the continent and divide the whole of Europe. East of the wall, Khrushchev's portrait may have been everywhere, but as a world leader, he'd lost face. It was an American spy plane that would save Khrushchev. In 1960, it was shot down over Russia, and its pilot, Gary Powers, was captured. The American cover story was blown apart when Powers later made a very public confession, and Khrushchev seized the chance to hit back. He demonstrated his frightening potential to strike at the West by exploding Russia's first hydrogen bomb. Then he pulled a trick in America's own backyard. His love affair with Castro made the US suspicious, and sure enough, in 1962, American spy planes discovered nuclear missile bases in Cuba, armed with Russian warheads. President Kennedy immediately put the US on war alert. Troops were called up, and American battleships set off to intercept the Russian fleet that was bearing more missiles to Cuba. The Cuban army flexed its tiny muscles, and in the capital, Havana, the entire population seemed to be treating the crisis as just another fiesta. The United Nations, however, took a more serious view. The Russians were condemned, and when Kennedy refused to back off, Khrushchev was humiliated. Khrushchev now looked eastwards to China and India, seeking new alliances, looking for compromise, not confrontation. And this gentler approach began to bring returns. When Russian Foreign Minister Gromyko signed a nuclear test ban agreement with his American and European counterparts, the whole world breathed a little easier. And Nikita Khrushchev could relish his new role as a peacemaker. He would not have long to enjoy it, for the men walking behind him were already planning his overthrow. The plotters were Alexei Kosygin, the Russian premier, seen here paying a visit to a British trade fair in Moscow, and a shrewd fellow conspirator from the old days, old poker face himself, Leonid Brezhnev. In 1964, they led the plot that deposed Khrushchev. And so the most electrifying personality in politics was gone. But he would be remembered as the man who gave communism a human face and helped open the door to world peace.